In today's video, we're going to go over the process and installation instructions on how to assemble a Bilstein-based Miata coilover kit. The kit in the video today is specific for a spec Miata race car. However, all of the kits we offer are based on the same parts with just different combinations of bump stops and spring rates. So these installation methods and instructions will carry over to all of our Bilstein-based coilover kits. We also offer a pre-assembled option on our website for a $100 labor fee, and this takes all of the guesswork out of assembling these yourself. We label these as DIY, as a do-it-yourself kit, because it is very possible to do this work in your own garage. There's nothing rocket science about it. It's just assembling parts and putting together a suspension package. So it's not impossible to do. There's not a lot of difficulty behind it, but it is a little labor intensive, and there are a couple of tricks along the way, which I'll show you my tricks in this video. So there's no secrets about it, but for $100 we do offer the pre-assembled option. Okay, so we're looking at my little workstation here in our shop, and one of the key things that you have to have is a vise, a bench vise, because you're going to need to stand this shock up to be able to work on it properly. So definitely have yourself something to hold the shock, preferably a bench vise. I'm not sure how else you could do this. So that's important, that's a key. And you're going to need a 19mm socket for the shoulder nuts to squeeze it all together. And with the shoulder nuts as well, you're going to want to pick yourself up some blue Loctite, medium strength. Also, I'm going to show you our method of securing the isolator to the shock hat. This is real important because we don't leave those as floating. We actually glue them to the NB upper shock mounts. So that is what these items are for back here. So basically our secret method, and I told you before, nothing's a secret, but where we charge for the installation of these and where it could be different than the directions that are provided by Fat Cat is that we sand down, not down, but we sand and scuff and prep the surfaces. As you can see, this is shiny, so glue doesn't really like to stick to that surface. Comparatively, the paint on the shock hats is also a little bit slick. So when you put one slick urethane surface and try to glue it to a slick metal surface, that typically doesn't work out for too long. It'll work at first, but after some use in the car and springs pounding on it and hitting the track, they could come loose. So I'll show you my method. And of course we have Goof Off, which is an adhesive, kind of like a remover spray cleaner. I use it as a cleaner, so for that I'm going to use to prep the isolators in the shock hats. And of course you see here Gorilla Glue, and this is the amber kind of Gorilla Glue. So this is in the original Fat Cat shock mount directions to use, and I've always used that and I find it to work pretty well. There is also the option to use windshield adhesive, and I looked at that at my local parts store, and it was just a Permatex variety, and I believe there is a stronger industrial variety of windshield adhesive, which I don't have readily available, nor do I think is going to be as easy to get as a Gorilla Glue. So we're just going to stick with the Gorilla Glue. And of course the water and the sponge are to apply the Gorilla Glue correctly. There is one last thing that I forgot, and I'm adding it to the table, and this is a RTV sealant, or sort of a RTV glue, and any variety of RTV sealant or glue basically will work. And what this is going to be used for is actually running a bead down the shocks when we install these coilover sleeves, because when these coilover sleeves go on the shocks, they can still be rotated very easily. When you're at the track working on the car and you want to adjust your ride height, you're going to have to turn these collars. So oftentimes these collars get a little bit tight from dirt and grime that builds up on the shocks, and it'll end up wanting to rotate the whole sleeve. So by using adhesive to seal the sleeve to the shock, we're making this process a little bit easier to perform when you're underneath the car at the track. So the first thing I like to do is take the goof off and prep the surfaces of all the isolators and the shock hats to get ready to take the sanding disc over here and get these roughed up a little bit to help that glue stick. And you can tell right after you use this goof off, it kind of helps strip away any mold release wax or oils that are left on the, most importantly, the isolator, but also it gets this paint on the shock hat a little bit tackier and a little bit more clean. So basically we don't want to grind in any oil that we don't need to grind in. And also with this kit, it used to come with alcohol cleaning pads. So if you have alcohol, basically any store variety of isopropyl alcohol, you can also use that too. The main point is to just try to get some of the oil and mold release compound off of this isolator. Now we're going to go ahead and take our little die grinder here, and I have a little sanding disc, just kind of you get at Harbor Freight. Nothing special, nothing fancy. And all I'm going to do is just go ahead and kind of scuff the surface of this paint and also the surface of this isolator. Now this is the most important and different part about what we do to pre-assemble these shocks for you, rather than what the instructions that Fat Cat Motorsports have always had said to do. This is something that I just came up with along the way that made me think that it would hold these isolators to these shock hats better. So you see it didn't take too long to scuff up the surface of this isolator here, and I'm getting the sun to shine on it at a good spot, and all you can see is just really scuffed up the surface and got rid of the shiny parts. And it also makes it a little bit tackier, a little bit stickier, like kind of activated the urethane a little bit when we use the sanding wheel on it. So that's good. And also the shock hat surface here, very basic. I'm just scuffing up the paint, kind of like when you'd prep the surface of metal to paint it. You want whatever you're trying to stick to it to adhere to it better. So that's it right there. And then we'll just give it another shot of goof off here, just to get the dust off of it and clean out the surfaces a little bit. Just make for a tidy installation. And after you use the goof off and you have everything prepped, if you put the isolator back into its spot on the shock hat, you can feel how it kind of sticks better already. So that just gives me a better, more confident feeling about these two parts sticking together for a longer time when they're on the car than if you were to just slap it together with both of those shiny surfaces still there. Okay, the next part of the process is to take your Gorilla Glue, and if you've ever used Gorilla Glue before, you know that it's water activated. So what we've done is put some water on our sponge here and kind of wet the surface, both surfaces is what I do, on the shock hat and the isolator. And of course you only really need to wet the surfaces that are going to be sticking together. So with those suitably moistened up, I just run a pretty thin bead of Gorilla Glue around the isolator the entire way, or close to it. Then I stick it onto the shock hat, kind of rotate it around to disperse that glue in there. And what the water does to this glue is it turns it into a foam basically, and that foam expands. So with that in mind, you want to make sure that you're putting a little bit of weight on these. So I'll take one of the heavier springs and just hold it down onto the top there, and with that it should hold it tight enough to where that glue is getting dispersed a little bit and it's not puffing out. So that's the most important thing. You don't want it to puff out. You can also do this on the shock, and I'll show you how to do this on the shock as well. So it's basically prepping the shock first, and then you prep this last, and you put it on the shock and then tighten the assembly together. And that's another way that I do it too. That'll make sure that the glue is getting squeezed out tight. But you can see already, maybe you can, maybe you can't, inside the shock hat here where the isolator is contacting the shock hat, it's already starting to bubble out and foam. So we're just going to set this aside and then let it put some weight on to that assembly over there. The next thing I'm doing is going to be to have the shock held tight for me so I can work on it. So I basically put it in my tiny little Harbor Freight vise here. Doesn't need to be held in like like it does in the car. Just something to keep it sturdy so you can work on it. And then what I like to do is take the rag that I did remove the goof off with and just kind of wipe off the surface of the shock to prep it a little bit for that adhesive. So I'd recommend taking your coilover sleeve and test fitting it on the shock that you're working on. So as you can see, this is a two-way coilover sleeve. So what that means is it can be installed in a higher mounting point or a lower mounting point. So obviously on a car where you want ride height, you'd want this to have more threads on the top. But with spec Miatas or track related cars, you want to put this on the lower position so you can drop it quite low, because we want our spec Miatas and race cars to have a lower ride height. So I would suggest putting on the lowest setting. Once you know that lowest setting, take it off and leave it down as it's going to be installed. So grab your RTV sealant and go ahead and run 4 beads of RTV in probably about 2 inches of length onto the Bilstein shock. And like I said before, what this does is it allows the shock sleeve, the coilover sleeve, and I rotate it a little bit to kind of make sure it's not pushing the silicone out to the side and getting on the threads down here. So you basically just slide the sleeve over the shock, over the silicone beads. Don't make them too thick to where they're just going to smush everywhere and be messy. And you can see it kind of gives it a little bit of resistance. Well, that resistance will dry up and cause this sleeve to be locked onto the shock body. And if you're worried later about being able to get this off, you should be able to pry it off. There's going to be a good deal of effort getting it off, obviously, but I'm convinced if you turn the shock, the coilover sleeve and shock alternately, you'll break free of that silicone and you'll be able to remove those collars later. And then, it might be a little bit of a mess to clean off the silicone, but at the end of the day, to me, it's more important to be able to adjust this collar at the track without having to hold this sleeve. Because when you have spring tension and a lot of things at work at the track, they're going to want to turn at the same time, and that's just annoying. Okay, so now we're going to begin the assembly of these shocks. So we're going to reach over and grab the components in order of where they go onto the shock. So of course the first thing you're going to grab is this 36mm bump stop. This is going to be oriented with the thin side on the top. The next thing you're going to grab is the Bilstein spacer, the little silver collar. That's going to go onto the shock shaft right there and sit on this shelf. Next thing is going to be the red washer, and this goes right on top of that Bilstein spacer. And at this point, you're going to want to put your spring onto the coilover because you're not going to be able to get it over the rest of the stuff. So since this is a rear shock, we know that because it's shorter, we're going to put our spring onto the coilover. And if you're OCD like me, you're going to want these numbers and the Eibach logo to be pointing the right way. And once that's on there, it's okay. So just make sure you got your bump stop, your Bilstein collar, and your red washer on, then your spring. From there, we're going to take our lower shock mount bushing. This is going to go on top of the red washer. Then we're going to prepare by grabbing the upper mount bushing, the silver washer, and the shoulder nut. And I like to put these three together right here on the bench. So I could just grab that little assembly and throw it on there. The next thing that needs to go on is the shock hat and isolator assembly that we glued together. That is just going to sit right on top of that whole assembly there, and you'll see a little bit of the shock top sticking out. At this point, I like to wind my spring up a little bit with the coilover sleeve to get it close to where it's making contact with that isolator, and this will help squeeze the whole assembly together and keep that glue sealed shut. And I leave a little bit of a gap in this spring because when we tighten this whole thing down, it's going to pull down and probably make contact with that anyways. Next, you're going to take your blue Loctite and you're going to put a little bit onto the shock shaft. Not too much, but just enough to where the threads will draw it down as you tighten the shoulder nut in. And then of course you grab the upper shock mount bushing, silver washer, and M10 shoulder nut and go ahead and thread that assembly together on top of your shock mount. And you'll get a couple of threads in by hand, but we're going to need to switch over to our 19mm socket here. So the last part of our assembly is to go ahead and tighten this top nut, the top shoulder nut down, and we can do this with a 3/8 ratchet as you're seeing here. And what you probably can't see too well is I am trying to hold the shock hat and the shock shaft from spinning because the resistance on this silver washer and this assembly is going to want to turn the shock hat and along with it the shock shaft. So the shock shaft will spin internally inside the Bilstein, but you don't want to do that too much because there's seals in there and stuff. So basically turn your wrench slowly enough to where you get this assembly squeezed down and you'll feel it bottom out onto the red washer inside, and that's when you know that it's complete. Your assembly is together at that point. And there's no torque value on it. Once it's bottomed out on that red washer inside, just kind of give it a good pull and not over tighten it, but you have that Loctite in there too to help you out. And it's okay if this top bushing and assembly spins. It will spin. And also you'll see that the upper shock mount bushing is going to get a little bit off-centered. That's okay as well. It'll eventually center itself out after use on the car. Okay, so I can feel that it's bottomed out, so I'm just going to give it a little bit more. and that should be good. It's going to squeeze down this yellow bushing, and it's going to kind of puff it out a little bit. And you can see it's a little bit off-centered, but that's okay. You have the shoulder nut in there to keep the whole thing from going too far in either direction. And with time, this will move and flex, and that's what it's designed to do. This whole assembly is designed to allow this shock hat to kind of float. So you have the lower shock mount bushing and the upper shock mount bushing squeezed together with the shoulder nut and the two washers. And in there, it provides that nice compliant cushioning for your whole shock top. So at this point, we're essentially done with this assembly. And as you can see, the spring has come up and is now pressing down on my isolator. So I like to tighten it up a little bit. And the other thing I like to do is put a little bit of oil in these threads. So I make sure I have enough threads to do that, obviously. And I just have this Brad Penn multi-purpose household oil. And what I do is loosen the threads enough. I'll have to go back down again. Loosen the threads so you can draw the collar up into the threads that are oiled. So now you can see I can rotate my spring so it's not in contact with the isolator anymore. And I just drop a couple of beads of oil down into that thread there. And then I tighten it back up, and it should draw that oil around. And you can definitely feel it being easier to turn at this point. And eventually that oil will dry up, or it'll get a little gunky because of the road dirt and grime. So it's just gonna, one of those little finishing touches for me. So what I like to do at this point is, now that I have some spring tension here, I like to leave this assembly together and tight so this glue has a good amount of time to set. I like to keep pressure on that Gorilla Glue, and I usually leave it for a day because I just want to make sure that that glue is squeezed as tight as it can be up there, and that it's going to set strong and not leave too much of an air gap or foam gap, I guess you could say, with the glue. So this is it. This is where I call this a done assembly, and I'm going to set this one aside and put the other ones together in the same way. The front shocks are no different. They go together the same way, and I'll show you one thing on the front shock about the coilover sleeve, and we can call this good. So with this being done, you saw my assembly procedure. This is the exact procedure that I use when I pre-assemble these shocks for you if you were to buy them. It's not a difficult assembly. You definitely should have the right tools. If you don't do it in this way, this is a little bit above and beyond the instructions, but I have seen or heard about people having the isolators pop out of the shock hats, which isn't a critical situation. They just are a little loose when the car is at full droop, the suspension. It's not really going to matter. However, these are just little finishing touches that I like to do. But in general, if you follow these procedures on your own and you use the right tools and the right materials, it's a fairly easy job that you can do on your own. So that's it. I'm going to show you one thing on the front shock here, and we'll sign off. So the thing I wanted to show you on the front shock is just the orientation of the coilover sleeve. And as I explained on the rear, there's two different heights that you could put these on. There's two different cutouts or perches inside of this coilover sleeve. So you can, as you can see this way, you have about a ½ inch of shock showing, which is fine. You do not want this coil over to be above the shock top there. That's important. If it's above that, it's going to hit your shock hat, potentially. So we'll flip this over, and you can see the second position actually does put this sleeve up a little bit too high. So we just don't want this sleeve to be up too high on this shock. We definitely want to use the lower position on these sleeves. And also, this is a little tricky. It's tricked me and caught me out before, but just make sure that your spring perch, your adjustable collar, has the wall provision on the right side. So when we send these, we'll send them like this to you, but just make sure, we don't know which way you're going to put it on. So just make sure that you're not putting it on to where this collar is on the flat side. You want this collar to have the raised provision to where the spring is going into the raised provision side, not this side, because the spring will hit your threads at that point, and of course it could mar those up. So that's just something to note, one of those little things to look for. So thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe, hit the notifications bell, and that'll ensure that you are notified whenever we come out with a new video. And of course, if you're not following our social media outlets already, 5X Racing on both Facebook and Instagram, stay tuned to those to have the latest updates, the latest product introductions, when we're open, when we're closed, and just fun stuff from the races. So I hope you're following us. If not, consider following us on those outlets to stay a little bit more informed and a little bit more in tune with what we're doing here at 5X Racing.